It's a good morning, good afternoon, evening. It's wonderful to have our international audience gathering again for a very important, I think, enlightening update on a topic that is on the minds of practically everybody in the Jewish world, namely, who is a Jew? And thanks to our speaker today, Nicole Maor, the director of the Legal Advocacy Centers for New Olim, for new immigrants at the Religious Actions, at the Israel Religious Action Center, Reform Center on Religion and State. We have added sort of a twist to the topic. As Nikki suggested, the topic is when is a convert not a convert? And that follows a ruling of the Supreme Court that was handed down recently and has shed some new disturbing perspective on the question of how far is the court willing to expand the definition of who is a Jew under the law of return and the Israeli population registry law, namely the civil meaning of the question of who is a Jew. But before we turn to Nikki, just a couple of announcements. First of all, an expression of gratitude and appreciation for our co-sponsors, and it's wonderful to see so many of the active leaders of both the Ruach Hidush, rabbis and cantors for religious freedom and equality in Israel, and JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and a number of the members of the executive committee and the court chairs are on this call, as well as now a long-time partner, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. The next webinar was announced as sharing with you, briefing you on the 2021 Israel Religion and State Index, which will be released, if all goes well, this Wednesday. Stay tuned. And in the invitation for this week's webinar, we said that we would be publishing the highlights of the index in the Thursday's newsletter. So if any of you does not receive our newsletter, for whatever reason, send me a note. The findings are important, I think are critical to understanding the particular junction we are in, both politically and socially in Israel, and they will be of great interest to all of you, I'm sure, especially as we open a new year with so many new beginnings. But the webinar in 2 weeks will not focus on the index. We just got confirmation from the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Dr. Nachman Shai, that he will be available to meet with us and provide us with the contents of the next webinar. So on September 13th at noon New York time, we will be hosting Dr. Nachman Shai, and I want to stress the importance of that webinar and the new Minister of Diaspora Affairs, because his is the first time that an Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs actually expresses a principled commitment to the notion of Jewish peoplehood that is all-inclusive, and that, as he calls it, the big tent has not only room, but should be accepting equally all streams in Judaism, all groups, shades, and denominations. And we'll be discussing that with him. And to the extent that we can help advance, support, push that direction, this is really a new approach of the Israeli government to the partnership with diaspora Jewry and an appreciation of its diversified, pluralistic character. So, thanks to our co-sponsors, and mostly today thanks to Nicole Maor Center, the wonderful friend and really the leading Israeli expert on all questions regarding who is a Jew and population registry, and most importantly, the rights and entitlement under the law of return. I've had the pleasure of working with Nikki during the years that I headed the Israel Religious Action Center. That pleasure now belongs to my friend Anat Hoffman, and there is no one like Nikki, both in terms of her expertise and clarity of mind and the ability to convey and bring across topics that are complex. So Nikki, tell us what's new. All of us are interested in this question, but not only in a theoretic context, but also how may it apply to Jewish communities throughout the world today?
Uri, thank you very much for putting me in a position of trying to make an impossible situation somewhat clear. I will try my best. And please, obviously, feel free to answer questions if what I'm talking about really doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, some of the judgments that have been made don't make too much sense. But I will try and explain the situation in a way that you can understand it, and that maybe we can also work together to help change the Israeli reality, so that Nachman Shai is going to be speaking within a few weeks, and the new Ministry of the Interior, that we can maybe really change the situation regarding emerging communities, so that this situation of Ronnie in Guatemala will be an incident that won't be repeated. Let's put it that way. But I'll try and explain right from the beginning, because it's the whole concept of an emerging community is something that is a new concept, that it's something that nobody really thought about until the last 10 years ago. And it's really a concept that we need to understand it both within the context of the Jewish world outside of Israel, and also in the context of the law of return in Israel. And that being said, also we need to understand that both the Jewish world inside and outside of Israel sometimes can be seen to be rather xenophobic regarding people of different color and of different socioeconomic status. And I think that also is an issue that is relevant to these communities, many of which were established because they were not seen they were not welcomed by the existing Jewish communities outside of Israel. But there are two different types of groups of people that have been called ultimately emerging communities. One are those groups of people who have absolutely no connection to Judaism, but throughout the years, for whatever reasons, began to lead full Jewish lives. They learned about Judaism from books and decided that that's the way of life they want to lead. And if we're talking about the Abu Yodaya in Uganda, if we're talking about the B'nai Menashe in India, even though there were those who claimed that they were some of the lost tribes, but that has been found as not to be has any basis. But these are groups of people. You have the Inca Jews in northern Peru, were groups of people who don't claim to have any Jewish background, but formed together and started living a Jewish life. You also have groups of people who do have some sort of connection with the Jewish world, whether they be fourth, fifth, sixth generation, or who trace their roots back to the Inquisition, the Marranos, who in the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, again, tried to come back to their roots, some of whom were not accepted by the existing Jewish communities, many of which were in Latin America. And these groups of people, again, formed communities amongst themselves, started living a Jewish life, even though they weren't seen to be Jewish in any shape or form by those around them. Now, these communities throughout the years became discovered, or they were discovered by different groups of people. Some of them were discovered by an organization called Kulanu, which is made up by representatives of most of the different streams of Judaism. Some were discovered by the Orthodox, some were discovered by the Israeli rabbinate, for example, or by people who are interested in discovering the lost Jews around the world. And these groups, one by one, or in different ways, were converted. The Abu Yedaya were converted by the conservative movement in a period of time over the last 20 years. A group in Guatemala, now called Adat Israel, was converted by rabbis from the Reform movement over 10 years ago. There have been groups in Peru, there have been groups in Colombia were converted by the Orthodox representatives, some of them from the rabbinate from Israel, others from people who claim to be Orthodox rabbis who actually aren't recognized by anyone. And you have the Bnei Menashe in India who started to be converted by the Israeli Orthodox rabbinate and then were not allowed to continue because the Indian government felt that the Israelis were trying to infiltrate the system, and they were stopped. And these communities, some of the ones, for example, that were converted by Reform and Masorti and conservative movements, were then included as part of the world, part of the congregations that were part of the world movement. So the Abu Yedaya have become part of mainstream Masorti Olami, the world movement of the Masorti movement. Guatemala, Adat Israel is now a member of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. The Pukal for Jews are now recognized also of the Masorti movement. And as far as the Jewish world outside of Israel was concerned, at least with those congregations which are members of the non-Orthodox movements, they're Jews like everybody else. Whether the congregation itself was formed by a group of people who converted or not was completely irrelevant once that entire congregation became accepted by the main movements. And so if there's a person living in Guatemala who now would like to go and live in the United States and become a member of a congregation, of a non-Orthodox congregation in the States, nobody would ask any question. They'd present their conversion certificate and they'd be recognized. And ultimately, in my outlook on life, that's how Israel should see them as well. They shouldn't be, if they're a member of one of our movements, there's no reason to distinguish between them and between any other convert, or in fact, between any other Jew from birth. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite sit all that easily with the law of return. And that is because the law of return, as I think we've mentioned in previous webinars, is a statement that was made in 1950 and then was reiterated in 1970, which didn't really come to terms with the reality of the Jewish world in the 2021. And when they tried to determine who was a Jew, and they, after many arguments in the Knesset, they decided that a Jew is a person who was born to a Jewish mother who was converted, the concept of who was a convert at that time was the traditional concept of a convert. What is a traditional concept of a convert? An individual who comes to a Jewish congregation, who's maybe married to a member, or is a child of or learned about the Jewish people through university, and comes to that Jewish congregation and says to the rabbi, I want to convert. And the rabbi says, fine, come and join my introduction to Judaism class. And after 6 months or a year, you'll be converted in my congregation. And 10 years later, that person decides to make Aliyah. And the law of return felt that that person shouldn't be treated any differently than a person who was a Jew from birth. And there's no difference whether that's a congregation that's a Reform congregation, a conservative congregation, so long as those congregations are seen to be part of the mainstream Jewish world. What happened in the 90s and early 2000s was the breakdown of barriers around the world, and hundreds of thousands, in fact, of people came to Israel who weren't Jewish and who weren't eligible under the law of return as foreign workers, as even those who crossed the border, and realized that in Israel, there is no way that one can get any sort of permanent status unless you're married to an Israeli or unless you're eligible under the law of return. And obviously these people who weren't Jewish from birth so they couldn't be eligible as Jews or children of or grandchildren of Jews, and many of them weren't married to Israelis, turned to the one other option that was available to them, and that was conversion. And all of a sudden, conversion in the eyes of many became parallel with taking advantage of the system in order to make aliyah, i.e., we're using this the tool of conversion, not because we really want to be Jewish people, but because we want to get a gateway into Israeli society and get automatic Israeli citizenship. As you know, there are almost no countries in the world who give automatic citizenship to foreigners, apart from Israel and Germany in a more limited way. And Israel obviously does it under the law of return. And so what happened was the Supreme Court, and in fact, together with the Reform movement and the Conservative movement and the Jewish Agency and representatives of the Orthodox movements, got together to draw up criteria that would distinguish between those converts whose conversion were real and should be accepted by Israel under the law of return as people who should be eligible for automatic citizenship, and those people who unfairly abuse the system in order to get citizenship where they shouldn't have otherwise got it. And these criteria were published in, well, they actually have never been formally published, but they were agreed upon and submitted to the Supreme Court in 2014 on the basis of everybody's understanding that a conversion is something that an individual does when he approaches his Jewish congregation and wants to be converted. And then we'd say, what happens then to groups of people like the Abu Udaya, like Ronnie in Guatemala, and how do these criteria work? Well, so let's take the example of Ronnie, which is the case of and it wasn't a Supreme Court decision, by the way, it was a district court decision. I wish it were a Supreme Court decision because I think this decision would have been different, but it was a district court. Ronnie was converted in Guatemala. Guatemala was a congregation that's called Adat Israel. It's a congregation that its founders were a group of people like I talked about who actually wanted to become Jews. They weren't accepted by the Orthodox established community in Guatemala. They were supported by non-Orthodox rabbis who taught them, who sponsored them, who gave them the wherewithal to create their own community. And in 2010, approximately, most of their founders were converted. And in 2012, the community was accepted into the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Ronnie joined the congregation in 2012. He was converted in 2014, and he applied to make Aliyah in 2019. Now, under any logical connection between his conversion and abuse of the system, it's clear that this person didn't abuse the system. He converted in 2012. He had nothing to do with the state of Israel. He wasn't in Israel illegally previously. He had no connections in Israel. He lived in his converting congregation for 7 years before he applied to make Aliyah. So in principle, he should have no problems making Aliyah. But he applied, and the Interior Ministry looks at the criteria. And the criteria says a person, what is a convert? A person who is converted in a recognized Jewish congregation. Okay, so let's have a look at the congregation. The congregation is a recognized Jewish congregation. It's accepted by the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Yes, but the group may have been accepted by the World Union, but let's look at this founding group. The founding group were not converted in a recognized Jewish congregation, were they? Because their congregation wasn't a recognized Jewish congregation when they got together. They were a group of people. They were converted outside the framework of a recognized Jewish congregation. If they were converted outside the framework of a recognized Jewish congregation, then even if the Reform movement recognized them, they cannot be recognized for the purpose of the law of return. And anybody who joins their congregation, including Ronnie, cannot be considered to be recognized as a member of a recognized Jewish congregation. Now, I said to them, look, that's just ridiculous. You can't keep this situation going on forever and forever. The founding members of these congregations have not applied to make Aliyah. the definition of their Judaism shouldn't be against the law of return and its criteria. It should be by the world union of the Jewish world outside of Israel where they're living, and we want them to be part of the Jewish people. So you have to accept them as a recognized Jewish congregation. And once you accept them as a recognized Jewish congregation, then Ronnie is an individual converting in a recognized Jewish congregation. And at that time, when we argued that, the head of the Interior Ministry was Aryeh Deri, who had no interest at all in supporting any more than he had to support. And he was also aware that not only were there Reform and conservative congregations, and that also one of the conservative congregations were the Abu Yadaya, who are Africans, they're Black. Many of the converts in Guatemala and in Colombia are colored. And he was terribly worried that if we open the gates to any of these congregations, we're going to have an influx of all these non-Jewish people who he doesn't consider Jewish, and God forbid the world will come to an end. So Aryeh Deri stood very, very steadfast on his position that there is no such thing as an emerging congregation who can be a person who's converted an emerging congregation who can be eligible to make Aliyah. So we took it to the court, and I tried to explain to the judge that this is a principal issue, that Israel has to recognize congregations that are members of the world movements of Judaism around the world. So you have to recognize the Adat Israel congregation as a Jewish congregation, just like you have to recognize the Abu Yadaya congregation as a member of as a recognized Jewish congregation. And the judge, who I think didn't really want to get his feet burnt by this whole issue, tried to avoid it. And so what he did was, on the one hand, he said, I'm not dealing with this principal issue that you keep telling me that I have to deal with. I'm not going to argue with you whether this is a recognized congregation or not. But if I look more closely, at Ronnie's conversion and at the congregation in Guatemala, and with the definition of a recognized, established Jewish congregation as determined by the Supreme Court and by your own criteria, which you in the conservative and reform movements, you stood behind them in 2014 when we drew them up. It says that a congregation, in order to be recognized for the purposes of conversion, has to be established. It has to be well established. And so if I look at the Guatemala congregation, it was only established in 2012. And the conversion took place in 2014. So I'm not saying that I'm never going to recognize the Guatemala congregation as a recognized congregation, but I'm going to say that at this point in time, when you bring me a convert who was converted in 2014, the congregation wasn't developed enough. And therefore, the Interior Ministry is reasonable in its position that in this particular case, at this particular time, not to recognize Ronnie's conversion. Now, his position is crazy if you have any sort of understanding of the Jewish world outside of Israel, where we have new congregations forming left, right, and center. You have a breakaway congregation here and a breakaway congregation there. And the Interior Ministry is now going to say, well, this breakaway congregation has been around for 2 years, therefore it's not an accepted, I mean, it doesn't work. And it just shows the disconnect in many ways between the understanding of a judge in Israel, or the lack of understanding of the judge in Israel, to the complexity of the Jewish world in general and out of Israel. And so what we decided to do is to try and resolve this issue, not through appealing his particular decision, but to work towards changing the system, to work towards changing the criteria, to work towards working with the new Ministry of Interior, with the Jewish Agency, where we now have representatives from the Reform and Conservative movements who have very senior positions, to make Israel understand that that position is untenable, and that a Jewish community which is recognized by the Jewish world outside of Israel has to be recognized by the State of Israel also. And if the State of Israel is worried that these type of congregations are established in order to run to Israel and for them all to get Israeli citizenship, then we need to readdress the issue of the criteria. And so let's make new criteria, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's not make a feeling of strengthening the disconnect between Israel and out of Israel. Let's try and bring the Jewish world and Israel together by realizing that what was maybe correct in 2014 is no longer correct in 2021. And if we look at some of the reports coming out of the self-identity of Jews in North America, at least, we're going to have to be dealing with new concepts of self-definition of Judaism in any case under the law of return. So at the moment, we are now under negotiations with the Jewish Agency and hopefully setting up a meeting soon with the Interior Ministry to try and see if we can address this issue or readdress this issue in order to solve, in particular, Ronnie's issue, but in general, all issues of congregations that are recognized by the Jewish world outside of Israel, in particular by our own movements, and so far have not been recognized for the purpose of the law of return. Uri, I think I'm close to boring you long enough before there are questions coming. If you want to have questions and I can ask questions more specifically.
I have never found and doubt that I'll ever find anything you say boring, and I don't think that that is, I'm sure that that is the case with everybody on this call. But maybe this is a good opportunity to bring in just a snippet of good news that's connected with what you said. Namely, yesterday you actually marked a victory in the Supreme Court on a related case, namely the rights of a widow of someone who was eligible to make Aliyah under the law of return, but passed away before the widow was able to implement that desire to come to Israel. So maybe just, you know, to have a positive infusion, maybe just say a word about that case. And the reason it's connected is that you are hoping to be able to work out the Guatemalan conversion with the Minister of the Interior. Well, good luck. Minister of the
I'm
Interior,
always an optimist, Uri, you know I'm always an optimist.
Well, the Minister of the Interior, others should realize, is Ayelet Shaked of Yamina, a token secularist or self-declared secularist in a relatively religious party headed by Naftali Bennett, who has long since made her views known, for instance, that in Israel, only halachic marriages under the chief rabbinate should be recognized, and God forbid civil marriage, etc., would all not just dilute, but undermine the Jewish character of the State of Israel. So she had something to say about your victory yesterday. So just share with us a word about the case and a word about our illustrious Minister of the Interior.
So, well, it's sort of we argued that the law of return, as you know, it allows both for 3 generations of Jews to make Aliyah, whether you're halachically Jewish or not, which, as you correctly said, Ayelet Shaked maybe would prefer that we went back to the original definition that the law of return is only for Jews. But the law of return is for Jews, a spouse of a Jew, a child of a Jew, a spouse of a child of a Jew, a grandchild of a Jew, and a spouse of a grandchild of a Jew. And we argued that all those spouses the spouse of the Jew, spouse of a child, and spouse of a grandchild must include also the widow of, that if one is a spouse and one is eligible while my husband or wife is alive, that right should continue even if my spouse passes away. Partially arguing that in America and in the former Soviet Union, a Jew is not necessarily defined by being born to a Jewish mother. A Jew may quite easily self-define as being born to a Jewish father. And if one is allowing the widow of a Jew, a halachic Jew, to make aliyah, one should also allow the widow of a non-halachic Jew to make aliyah, because their connection with Israel, with Judaism, with the Jewish world will be as strong, and in many cases even stronger than those who were by accident born to a Jewish mother. And we actually used a lot of the discussions from the 1970 Knesset arguments regarding the whole question of who is a Jew and who should be eligible under law of return to persuade the Supreme Court that that was the original idea when the amendment of the law was drawn up. And luckily, the majority of the court agreed with us and said that the law of return should be a law that is inclusive rather than, it's limited in any case, but those who it limits to, it should be inclusive and not exclusive to the weakest link in many ways to those eligible, because the widow obviously is one of the weakest links in terms of their own ability to represent themselves and to fight for their rights. And so we took on the fight for the widow, as I think any good Jew should do. And very glad to say that the Supreme Court, after 2.5 years deliberation, which isn't so long for the Supreme Court actually, handed a decision in our favor.
A majority decision that
Yes.
I think sensitizes us to the challenge that we face in Israel when, unlike the US Supreme Court, which sits in full panel hearing cases, in Israel, it's usually a panel of 3, sometimes of 5, and the question of the balancing between the conservative Orthodox judges and the others is critical to the outcome of a case. So this was one of those cases, right?
Yes, we were very lucky. And in fact, when I speak to the state attorney, who was not terribly happy about the fact that we won and he lost, and I said to him, are you going to try and take it one step further? He said to me, there are too many non-Orthodox judges left on the Supreme Court. There's no chance. But so his whole concept was, well, let's see what our chances are of getting a conservative or non-conservative judge. And hopefully that he will keep his position that he doesn't have a chance. But yes, that is a very, very, very relevant question as to what bench you happen to fall on, and whether you're lucky enough to fall on a bench that is sympathetic in its outlook to what you're trying to argue.
So back to the question of the Minister of the Interior, who is a member of the committee, the official committee that is comprised of representatives of the government, the Knesset, the Israeli Bar, and the court, the Supreme Court, that nominates or appoints new judges for the different courts in Israel. And there are coming up a number of appointments to the Supreme Court as a number of the justices are retiring. So what has our Minister of the Interior got to say about this important victory?
Yes, well, Uri, you look so happy that you can tell them that what people are so probably not surprised to hear, that she said that she will do what she can in order to influence the choice of new judges in such a way that this decision would not repeat itself. That was more or less her statement to the press.
So the statement is anchored in a position that has to do with Gordon Silverman's question, namely, should Israel interfere with the definition of who is a Jew and the method of conversion that is practiced in communities throughout the world? Obviously, one would hope that it would be the widest possible definition and the most inclusive one, but for the likes of our Minister of the Interior and many others who have expressed themselves in the last couple of days since the court ruling, this is not the case. Namely, these instances in which a non-Jewish widow or a convert in an emerging community, especially if that convert happens to be colored or black, are all, in their view, a threat to the Jewish character of the State of Israel. And I know that I sound harsh, but the reality is harsh. And we are dealing with a clash. It's not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of perspectives and visions as to what does being a Jewish and democratic state mean. So would you care to comment on a couple of questions that were raised already in the chat, namely, isn't it to Israel's interest and to the Jewish people's interest, looking at the larger picture, to have as many Jews as possible? Namely, rather add on than alienate and detract. And what do you say about the question of how far can Israel go in terms of limiting the acceptance of conversions that some Jewish community may find acceptable?
Yes. It's for someone who is a liberal Jew, it just seems incomprehensible that what Israel's position in many ways is cutting your nose to spite your face. We want to have a Jewish majority in Israel. We want to keep Jewish values alive in Israel, and we have been, whether we want to or we don't want to, we've been forced to recognize the fact that there are different streams of Judaism, and those Jews who are members of those streams are recognized by the State of Israel. So yes, it should be in Israel's interest, and I think you probably find that the majority of Israelis would agree that it's in Israel's interest for all those people to make Aliyah. The issue is the question of who controls the gates, and the Interior Ministry will say, we want to have that control, and they don't. And so, for example, and I'll give an example where they parallel the situation to try and prove that they're not racist. They'll say, well, look at the Falashmura. They're a whole group of non-Jewish people, and we let them all into Israel, and we converted them in Israel. And so we're broadening the scope of the Jewish world, but it's under our decisions and not under the decisions of the non-Orthodox movements who will decide which people are acceptable or not. And so they're saying, if you want these people to be recognized by the State of Israel, then go to the government and get a government decision. That's what we did with the Falashmura. That's what we did with the Bnei Menashe. Get a government decision to say that, yes, Israel has an interest in those people coming to Israel, and we'll let them in. The difference is that those people were not converted before they came into Israel, and these people are converted. They are converted by recognized Jewish streams of Judaism, recognized Jewish streams into the Jewish world. So their argument doesn't work, but a lot of it comes down to this question of control. And again, this fear that the keys to the State of Israel are being given to the non-Orthodox movements and even the Orthodox movements outside of Israel who don't understand enough. And therefore, we don't have to accept all these people. As again, hopefully we will be able to get the Jewish Agency on board and fight this argument and get the Jewish Agency to say, we will support the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism and the Orthodox streams of Judaism outside of Israel who are responsible and who are careful and will not let just anyone become a member of their movements. But yes, it is a bit difficult to understand why Israel wants to remain a Jewish and democratic state on the one hand and is refusing to allow people who so clearly self-identify as Jews on the other hand.
Well, you mentioned the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency in the next few days is going to decide who its next chair is going to be. And that may go a long way in determining whether the Jewish Agency is going to be a partner in pursuing this necessary direction. Past record does not give us much confidence in the Jewish Agency's willingness to put its neck on a shaky, pluralistic personal status issue. They did take a strong stand on funding, and they did take a strong sense on the traditional Jew question, namely civil recognition for converts who converted under Reform Conservative. They're still hazy about Reconstructionist and renewal, as Nikki, you know better than everybody else. And Nikki is working on that front as well. But the question of whether the Jewish Agency is going to represent the sort of wide consensus, pluralistic consensus of Jewish communities remains to be seen. There are a number of people on this call who actually have influence on the local federations and the national and international body. It would be wonderful if people took the initiative to convey to the respective powers that be that you care, and that it's important that the Jewish Agency takes the stand of the sons of light in a confrontation against those who want to take Israel to a fundamentalist, coercive, minimalist Jewish reality. So talking about they don't know, one of the questions was, and I don't know whether you have the answer, has Israeli representatives, official representatives, actually visited those emerging communities to have a first-hand understanding of the validity of their Jewish identification?
No, the members of the Jewish Agency have, and in fact, in some of the cases, the members of the Jewish Agency, in fact, have come back with very clear, glowing reports that these are Jewish communities that are serious and should be recognized as Jewish communities. But the Interior Ministry has never, ever sent any of its representatives outside of Israel. And again, this is where we see why the Interior Ministry has such a lack of understanding of the Jewish world outside of Israel. And yes, if one, I mean, I'm trying to get the staff of the Interior Ministry to sit with me so I can give them a lecture about the different streams of Judaism in Israel without them having to move anywhere. And that is quite difficult, even though they did say that they would be interested in it. But yes, they really don't have an understanding of these communities. And we're talking about decisions from clerks and from legal advisors who've been sitting there for 20 years and are not interested in change and are not interested in broadening the scope of who is recognized as a Jew. In fact, the opposite.
Well, you are kind in saying they're not interested. We need to bear in mind that for most of recent decades, the Ministry of the Interior has been under ultra-Orthodox or Zionist Orthodox control, and the appointments to key positions, and sometimes to less than key positions, has gone along the lines of religious identity, and the Ministry of the Interior is heavily populated with people who are not just not interested, but are antagonistic to the notion of pluralism and religious freedom, which is certainly a challenge. So talking about that, and while I urge people to to write questions on the chat if there are issues you want Nikki to respond to, let me ask you in a related area, what's your view on one of the initiatives of the new government, led in that sense by Yamina, by Naftali Bennett and the Minister of Religious Services, Matan Kahana, from that party, to change the conversion laws in Israel, but change them so that they wouldn't be open to a pluralistic full acceptance of conversion, but would slightly shift to include the modern Orthodox, which are as unacceptable to the chief rabbinate as Reform conservative. So what do you think about this new initiative that is aimed at expanding the scope of formal acceptance of conversions in Israel to the modern Orthodox as well, regardless of whether the chief rabbinate is happy about it or not?
I'm always a little bit afraid. First of all, we need to understand that up until today, there is no conversion law. There is no law that determines who is a convert and who has the authority to convert. And we've worked very, very hard to keep it that way so that we can always argue for the rights of our conversions within the framework of the legal system and not the Knesset political system. So whenever somebody suggests to bring out a law that deals with conversion, we're always a little bit worried that even if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, even if the intention was good, you can never know what is going to happen once it gets to the floor of the Knesset. That being said, at the moment in this government, the chances that a law would be passed that would be detrimental to the non-Orthodox movements is probably the smallest chance that there has been in the last 20 years. And there's no question that taking away some of the monopoly from the ultra-Orthodox and broadening the scope for conversion in Israel is never going to be a bad thing. Again, so long as it doesn't affect the definition of who is a Jew for the purpose of the law of return, and so long as it doesn't detriment the battles that we've fought for and won up until now regarding the recognition of non-Orthodox conversion.
I would like to second your assertion that we should work very hard to keep the lack of or the absence of a definition in the law in effect. And for those on the call who are interested in this interfacing of law and religion in Israel, the general principle that is anchored, ingrained in the Declaration of Independence of religious freedom, freedom of religion and conscience, has been used by the court, especially the Supreme Court, to interpret existing laws so long as they are, so long as it's possible to interpret them within the scope of religious freedom. And certainly when there is no definition in the law, then the principle of religious freedom and equality would apply. But once the law limits the definition of who is a Jew, it becomes more difficult for the courts to interpret it in a pluralistic, expanded way. Now, this brings into question something that we have discussed here on these webinars a number of times, especially with Professor Rivka Weil of the IDC, namely the question of the Supreme Court voiding Knesset legislation on the basis of the general principles of the basic constitutional laws, a highly controversial issue. And the court is hesitant to invalidate laws as being unconstitutional. So long as we don't have the Knesset legislate on who is a Jew, knowing that if it does legislate, it's unlikely that it would legislate in as inclusive and pluralistic way as we would like it to, then I think it's important to understand that as we try to understand the battles, the legal and political battles in Israel. Alan Warshaw is asking, what do we, as members of diaspora, can do to influence the ministers in Israel, writing campaigns, individual letters, etc., write to other organizations? Do you have a comment regarding how does one make a difference if you're not in the midst of the litigation?
I think, first of all, writing to the Jewish federations, writing to the members of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is supposed to be your voice, and being involved and making your comments known is vitally important. The Jewish Agency has representatives all around the place. Also to the embassies, that's your voice that you need to use. I think writing from outside of Israel to ministers in Israel is not going to get you very far. But of course, don't forget that we now have our own minister in the government, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, and I'm sure that if you write to him, he will also take it on board and use the position that he has to try and influence as much as he possibly can once he gets back on his feet. Hopefully he will soon, because he's been ill. Yeah, I would take those. You speak with your rabbis, those who aren't rabbis, who are members of congregations, and get the ball rolling that way.
Just a comment on that. I think it's very important for those who are willing to be part of the solution, because frankly, those who are not actively part of the solution are part of the problem. This is very true. But just to add to that, it's really important to work to break the silo mentality. Namely, it's unless you are Sheldon Adelson, alav shalom, or well, I don't want to give other examples, but unless you're a person of that clout, financial, political, public clout, the essence of successful advocacy is about joining hands together. It's important for local activists of different denominations to work in concert. It's important to reach out and enlist local modern Orthodox lay leaders, rabbis, cantors, to be part of that and to be able to convey a unified and unifying message in support of pluralism and inclusiveness. It's then important to enlist the local organizations that are reluctant to enter into this minefield, such as the local federation, such as the local AJC chapter, such as the local ADL chapter. All of them have more or less chosen to sit on the fence. So initially expand the scope by collaborating, cooperating with other streams, other local activists, and work together, and then reach out to local influential organizations, and then of course take it to the national and international level. Another question that was asked is, how would you deal with African American Jewish congregations, not to be confused with the Black Hebrews, that largely follow conservative practice and that are now several generations old, but whose members were mostly never formally converted by any American movement?
Unfortunately, their situation is easy in the sense that because they were never converted and they were not born as Jews or children of or grandchildren of, they're just not allowed to make Aliyah at all. Their self-definition and self-identity as Judaism clashes completely with the law of return. And in fact, I've had a couple of people who have written to me from some of these congregations, and I've had very, very sadly to say to them that unless they go and get converted within the framework of a recognized Jewish community, they will not be able to make Aliyah under the law of return. They're not there. They don't even get to stage one because they were never converted.
Last question posted by Gordon Silverman. What is the status of the law that states that conversions made by the more liberal movements outside Israel are acceptable for the law of return?
That's not a law. That is a Supreme Court judgment. And that Supreme Court judgment is in force and is being upheld even, my goodness, but yes, it is being upheld by the Interior Ministry, and it will continue to be upheld so long as there is no law stating the opposite. The fact that conversions are recognized, the conversions made by the liberal movements are acceptable for the law of return, is the Supreme Court interpreting who is a Jew and who is a convert for the law of return. And they're the fights that we have won. Uri was actively involved in the beginning, and I took over after him to persuade the majority of the Supreme Court. And this time it wasn't 3 or 2, this was 11 and 13 judges of the Supreme Court to say that Israel is a democratic, and it's nice maybe to end on this note, is a democratic and pluralistic Jewish state that does represent the Jewish nation of all streams of Judaism. And until that law is changed, and hopefully it will never be changed, non-Orthodox conversions performed in and outside of Israel are recognized for the purpose of the law of return, so long as at the moment those conversions are performed within a recognized Jewish community that was formed by Jews from birth and not Jews by choice, and has a rabbi leading it. So we're going to try and keep working on the second part of that, but the first part of that is well entrenched.
So you have shared with us a mix of some disturbing developments, some challenging developments, and some continued good news, which is wonderful. I want to go back to the beginning of the session and say, stay tuned for Thursday's newsletter and the update on the 2021 Israel Religion and State Index. One of the things that you will find of interest there, which is relevant to our conversation, is that only a small minority of Israelis, Israeli adult Jews, find that any Orthodox conversion is necessary in order for the state to recognize a person, especially of the new immigrants community, who is a patrilineal Jew and considers himself, herself Jewish, and is absorbed into the Jewish community. So most Israeli Jews do not find that such a person requires an Orthodox conversion before the state recognizes him or her civilly as a Jew. It's very important to understand that the Israeli Jewish population is far more pluralistic, far more oriented toward religious freedom and freedom of choice than the official Israeli representatives, even under the current government, would lead you to believe. It's important that we know these facts and we are able to share them with our friends, with other activists, and in dialogue with the Israeli representatives. But as I pointed out, a good piece of news regarding the government is the appointment of Dr. Nachman Shai as Minister of Diaspora Affairs, who actually comes from a pluralistic perspective and has made it very clear on the day of his entering into office that he believes in equal rights, equal recognition, equal acceptance of the streams. Thank to our co-sponsors, Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, and for those rabbis and cantors on the call who actually want to help make a difference and you are not members yet, or who know of rabbis and cantors who are not members yet, encourage them to join Ruach Chidush, J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the same message applies here. If you are attorneys, or if you have an attorney as a son or as a son-in-law who is not a member of J-Plan and feels committed to the cause of religious pluralism, encourage them to be in touch with us and join J-Plan. AA, JLJ, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, thank you as well. And mostly, thank you, Nikki. Wonderful to have you speak to us again and enlighten us as to these important developments. And until the next time. So shalom. In 2 weeks, it will be Dr. Nachman Shai, if all goes well, who will be with us to explain and respond to your questions.
And Shana Tova to everyone, wishing you all a wonderful and healthy new year here from Israel and forever around the world. Hoping this next coming year will be a healthy one and a community one, and one that we can all look back with with relief that the last couple of years are behind us. So Shana Tova to you all.
Shana
Shana
Tova,
Tova.
spoken like a true rabbi. Shana Tova, shalom, friend.
Shana Tova.